Hey, good morning, everyone, and happy Friday to you. I have two questions for us to consider this morning, looking through the Word with my coffee. One is a question that you've probably heard a lot lately, and the other is maybe a question that you have not considered. With the news being so polarizing and divisive, unbelievably and heartbreakingly so, the questions for us to consider this morning are, who is my neighbor? And also, who is my enemy? I remember a time years ago, as I said, I've been reading in the book of Psalms, and this last week I read through a few passages that talked about the Lord's dealings with our enemies. And I was reminded of a hard time a number of years ago where I went through a real challenging relationship time with some individuals. And at the time, every scripture verse I was reading that had to do with enemies had to do with them in my mind. Like, Lord, strike down my enemies. And I remember so clearly in that season, the Lord speaking so kindly but firmly with me, asking me, but who are your enemies? And really giving me pause to take a step back from my situation, not turning a blind eye to maybe the pain and frustration I was feeling, but just to take a step back and really see this individual for who they really are. Kind of separate from my experience, but for who they really are. In Ephesians 6:12, we have this verse that I think really speaks to this question of who is my enemy, when it says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places." In other words, we don't wrestle with mankind. We wrestle with all this stuff that we can't see. Satan himself and his influence, spiritual forces at work. It's not about the individual. It's about the work of Satan. That is our enemy. As we consider the question, who is my neighbor? This comes from the Gospels, where the disciples are asking Jesus, essentially, well, who is that? When Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God above all else." And then the second commandment is like it, "You shall love the neighbor as yourself." And they say, well, who's that? And essentially the answer is everyone. Everyone is your neighbor. In Matthew 5, it's verse 43, Jesus says, "You've heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven." To me, this is a challenge for all of us to take away today. Jesus calling us to a higher standard. He calls us to be radical in the way that we care for and look to the needs of those around us. Radical where we are actually loving our enemies. Where we say, who is my neighbor? Everyone. And who is my enemy? No one. To see those around us as souls that Jesus Christ has died to save. They are precious in his sight, and no matter what they may do, or even the wickedness that they may be capable of in their doing, that they are still souls that Christ died to save, and to see them as the beloved of God in that way. I love this verse in Romans 5:10. This is in the Good News translation. It says, "We were God's enemies, but he made us his friends through the death of his son, Jesus. And now that we are God's friends, how much more will we be saved by Christ's life?" Just that reminder that we also have been God's enemies. but he has made us his friends through the death of his son. What a gift that is. What radical love that is. Friends, let's have radical love with those around us, loving our enemies, embracing them as Christ's beloved of God, and loving our neighbors as ourselves. Be challenged today, be encouraged, and have a great Friday.